Gold ships cut through the Atlantic under armed escort, their hulls riding low, their decks crowded with guards, their course set for Europe. Each vessel carried metal torn from distant ground, stamped into bars, and transformed into certainty. When these ships arrived, bells rang, ledgers opened, and the machinery of empire moved again. Few powers in history ever looked as secure as Spain did in these moments. Vaults filled, armies were paid, courts exhaled. From the outside, this was what dominance looked like. Wealth arrived on schedule. Power followed. Yet this story does not begin with conquest or glory. It begins with an idea, a dangerous one. The belief that money can replace strength. The belief that wealth arriving from elsewhere is the same as wealth built from within. We are taught that riches protect empires. The truth is harsher. Riches, when misunderstood, can quietly destroy them. Spain's collapse did not announce itself with fire or revolution. It crept forward through account books and contracts. It moved through interest rates and promises. It advanced during moments of apparent triumph. Think about that. An empire drowning in silver, yet constantly short of cash. An empire feared across continents, yet dependent on lenders it could never fully escape. This is a story about power that looked permanent and fragility that stayed hidden, about decisions made in quiet rooms with marble floors, decisions that echoed across oceans, and about a question Spain never truly answered in time. Can an empire survive if it spends faster than it produces? At its height, Spain stood at the center of a newly connected world. Oceans were no longer barriers. They were highways. Resources flowed inward from lands most Europeans could barely imagine. Mines carved into mountains sent wealth across seas. Ports swelled with cargo. The crown collected, spent, and borrowed at a scale never seen before. To contemporaries, this looked like progress. This looked like inevitability. If power had a sound, it was the clink of silver on stone. If dominance had a shape, it was a galleon riding the tide. But beneath the spectacle, a more important story was unfolding. One that had little to do with ships or soldiers, and everything to do with how power was financed. Money is never just money. It is permission. It allows states to act without delay. It lets leaders postpone consequences. It smooths over mistakes. For Spain, silver became more than currency. It became a substitute for reform. When problems appeared, they were paid away. When costs rose, they were financed. When wars expanded, loans bridged the gap. The system seemed elegant. Wealth arrived. Expenses were met. Tomorrow would take care of itself. This belief was not born of ignorance. It was born of success. For decades, the model worked well enough to silence doubt. That was its greatest danger. From the outside, Spain appeared to control its destiny. Inside, the state grew accustomed to treating income as permanent and obligations as temporary. Spending became policy. Borrowing became routine. The distinction between revenue and credit blurred. Silver shipments were already spoken for before they arrived. Money entered the empire and passed through it almost immediately, flowing outward to creditors, suppliers, and allies. Spain became a transit point for its own wealth. The crown held power, but not liquidity. Control, but not flexibility. The appearance of abundance hid a growing dependence on future deliveries that had not yet been secured. Imagine standing inside a royal chamber as decisions were made. Maps on the walls. Reports on the table. Confidence in every voice. Wars planned with the assumption that money would arrive as it always had. This was not recklessness. It was habit. The system rewarded belief. As long as silver kept coming, doubts felt unnecessary. But economic systems are not built on belief. They are built on capacity, on production, on resilience. Spain was accumulating money without building the foundations that make money durable. That imbalance did not matter in moments of calm. It mattered deeply under strain. The empire's strength rested on inflows rather than engines. Wealth was extracted, not generated. Finished goods were imported, not produced. Credit filled the gaps left by weak domestic capacity. Every year, obligations grew. Every year, interest claims thickened. The state could service its debts only by assuming tomorrow would resemble yesterday. This was a silent assumption behind every decision. Think about that. An empire structured not around what it made, but around what it expected to receive. This expectation reshaped behavior. When wealth appears automatic, discipline erodes. When money arrives without effort, efficiency loses urgency. Spain did not lack intelligence or experience. It lacked pressure to change. The silver acted like a cushion. It softened every fall. It delayed every reckoning. Leaders learned that consequences could be postponed indefinitely. In reality, they were only accumulating. Financial systems do not forget. They remember quietly, compounding in the background. The most dangerous period for any power is not poverty. It is abundance without understanding. Spain's leaders mistook cash flow for strength. They mistook access to money for control over it. But control belongs to those who can generate value, not merely receive it. This distinction mattered little at first. It would matter enormously later. As long as the empire expanded, the structure seemed justified. But expansion itself increased costs. More territory required more soldiers, more ships, more administration. Each success raised the baseline. Each victory locked in higher expenses. The empire grew faster than its capacity to sustain itself. Think about the rhythm of this system. Silver arrives. Bills are paid. Loans are rolled forward. The next shipment is already assigned. There is no pause, no buffer, no moment to rebuild foundations. The system demands constant motion. Any disruption becomes existential. Any delay creates panic. This is the hidden vulnerability of wealth built on inflows. It feels powerful until the moment it is not. And when that moment comes, the fall is not dramatic. It is administrative. Soldiers wait. Creditors demand. Confidence slips. Spain's financial model shaped its politics, its wars, and its sense of time. The future became a place where problems lived. The present became a place of comfort. This inversion is subtle, but fatal. States that live in the present lose the ability to absorb shocks. They react rather than prepare. They borrow rather than build. Spain's leaders were not blind. They were constrained by the success of a system that punished restraint and rewarded continuation. Reform threatened stability. Continuity felt safer. That choice would define everything that followed. This story is not about greed alone. It is about structure, about how incentives shape behavior, about how early success can lock systems into paths that later become traps. Spain did not choose collapse. It chose delay. It chose to substitute money for capacity. It chose to believe that wealth arriving by ship could stand in for an economy built at home. For a long time, this belief was validated. That validation made it harder to abandon. The stakes of this story reach far beyond Spain. This was one of the first global financial systems. Decisions made here rippled outward, affecting markets, wars, and states far away. The mechanism Spain pioneered will be copied, refined, and repeated by others. The lesson will be learned slowly and often ignored. Money can move faster than reform. Credit can mask weakness longer than leaders expect. But neither can replace production. Neither can create resilience on its own. As the empire stood at its apparent peak, few questioned its foundations. Why would they? The ships kept arriving. The silver kept flowing. Power seemed absolute. Yet beneath the surface, the clock had already started. The collapse was not waiting for a single disaster. It was being built daily, quietly, through routine decisions, through habits reinforced by abundance, through confidence earned too easily. This is where the story truly begins. Not at the moment of decline, but at the moment of certainty, at the height of confidence, when Spain believed it had solved the problem of power forever. For a time, the illusion worked. Spain's cities expanded with a confidence that felt permanent. Stone replaced wood. Streets widened. Cathedrals rose slowly, deliberately, their towers designed to outlast generations. Inside royal courts, silk and silver moved together. Imported wealth paid for ceremony, war, and reassurance. This was not just prosperity. It was spectacle. To foreign observers, Spain looked like the natural center of power in the world. Its reach stretched across oceans. Its armies moved with funding already secured. Its crown spoke with the authority of a state that never seemed to run out of money. Silver flowed from distant mines in a steady rhythm. It crossed oceans, passed through ports, and entered treasuries before racing onward again. Soldiers were paid. Ships were built. Creditors were satisfied. The system appeared smooth, almost mechanical. Imagine standing in the capital during these years. Treasuries looked full. Courtiers spoke confidently. War plans were drawn without hesitation. The future felt manageable because the present was funded. Few questioned where the money truly went or how long it could last. When wealth arrives reliably, scrutiny feels unnecessary. From the outside, Spain's dominance appeared unquestionable. Its banners flew across Europe and the Americas. Its fleets guarded key trade routes. Its rivals struggled to match its spending power. Influence was purchased as much as it was enforced. Alliances were secured with payments. Conflicts were resolved with subsidies. This was power expressed through finance. The ability to pay quickly became the ability to decide. But there was a difference between commanding outcomes and sustaining them. Spain's system was optimized for action, not endurance. Beneath the surface, something crucial was missing. Spain was consuming wealth, not building it. Production lagged behind expenditure. Manufacturing remained limited. Skilled labor flowed outward rather than multiplying at home. Agriculture failed to modernize at the pace required to support a growing state. The empire imported what it needed and paid for it with silver. This arrangement worked only as long as inflows continued. It discouraged investment in domestic capacity. Why develop industries when finished goods could be purchased instantly? Why endure reform when tomorrow's shipment could solve today's problem? Trade profits leaked outward. Merchants based elsewhere captured margins. Foreign workshops supplied weapons, ships, and tools. Spain paid for everything but produced relatively little strategic value. The empire's economy became strangely hollow. Wealth entered and exited without settling. The crown controlled vast territories, yet relied on others to equip its power. This reliance was not obvious at first. It hid behind abundance. But dependence does not disappear because it is affordable. It only becomes quieter. The financial structure of the empire reinforced these habits. Wars were financed not by accumulated surplus, but by promises against future deliveries. Debt rolled forward smoothly. Interest compounded quietly. Lenders were confident because the silver kept coming. Each loan assumed the next shipment. Each shipment arrived already claimed. This cycle normalized borrowing as a tool of governance. Debt was no longer an emergency measure. It was a permanent feature of the system. Think about that. An empire fighting wars not with reserves, but with expectations. This arrangement shaped decision-making at every level. Leaders became comfortable with delay. Structural reform felt optional. Hard choices could be postponed without immediate cost. When problems emerged, money softened them. When expenses rose, credit bridged the gap. The system rewarded short-term stability over long-term strength. Every year without crisis confirmed the belief that the model was sound. Success reinforced complacency. Complacency bred fragility. The illusion of strength was not just economic. It was psychological. Confidence became cultural. Spain's leaders believed they had discovered a new way to sustain empire. Wealth from abroad could replace domestic growth. Control over resources could substitute for productive depth. This belief spread through institutions. Spending became a sign of authority. Restraint looked like weakness. To cut costs or reform systems felt unnecessary when money was plentiful. Yet abundance has a way of hiding costs rather than eliminating them. As the empire expanded, its obligations multiplied. More territory required more administration, more soldiers, more ships. Each expansion increased fixed costs. The baseline rose year after year. Silver shipments did not create flexibility. They locked the state into higher spending commitments. Once established, these commitments were politically difficult to reverse. Armies could not simply be dismissed. Allies could not be abandoned without consequence. The empire grew large quickly, but it grew rigid just as fast. This rigidity was masked by motion. As long as silver moved, everything moved with it. Money flowed through the system like blood through veins, keeping institutions alive without strengthening the body. Spain mistook circulation for health. But circulation without regeneration leads to exhaustion. The economy was active, but not resilient. Busy, but not productive. This distinction would become critical later. Foreign bankers played a growing role in sustaining the illusion. They advanced funds, managed transfers, and absorbed risk. In return, they gained influence. The crown depended on them to function smoothly. This dependence did not feel threatening at first. Credit was available. Terms were manageable. Confidence was mutual. But reliance shifts leverage. Over time, the ability to say no diminishes. Financial flexibility narrows. Decisions become constrained by obligations made years earlier. Why invest heavily in domestic industry when capital could be borrowed cheaply? Why endure political resistance to reform when silver paid the bills? These questions answer themselves through inaction. The path of least resistance became the path of policy. The empire drifted into a financial posture that prioritized continuity over capacity. It was easier to maintain appearances than to rebuild foundations. Easier to borrow than to restructure. Easier to spend than to save. This was the illusion of strength. Power fueled by inflows rather than engines. Authority backed by money rather than systems. It looked convincing because it worked in calm conditions. But calm conditions are not permanent. Every system is tested eventually. Spain's test would come from multiple directions at once. But long before that moment arrived, the weaknesses were already embedded. Think about how the system responded to risk. It had little margin for error. Any disruption threatened liquidity. Any delay caused strain. There were no deep reserves to absorb shocks. No diversified production to compensate for loss. Everything depended on continuity. Continuity of extraction. Continuity of transport. Continuity of credit. This made the empire powerful in motion and vulnerable at rest. The illusion also reshaped how rivals perceived Spain. They saw wealth and assumed strength. They underestimated the fragility beneath the surface. This miscalculation would matter later. But for now, Spain's image worked in its favor. Fear and respect bought time. That time was spent expanding commitments rather than strengthening foundations. The empire lived forward without building inward. Inside the state, warnings existed. Some recognized imbalance. Some understood that consumption without production carries a cost. But warnings struggled to compete with success. As long as money arrived, skepticism sounded abstract. Reform lacked urgency. Leaders operate within incentives. Spain's incentives rewarded continuation. The system punished hesitation. To slow down felt dangerous when rivals watched closely. Silver delayed reckoning. It allowed Spain to function beyond its economic capacity. It enabled decisions that would otherwise have been impossible. But delay is not prevention. It is accumulation. Every year without reform added pressure. Every loan increased sensitivity to disruption. The illusion of strength hardened into dependency. Dependency narrowed options. This period was not a mistake in isolation. It was a sequence of rational choices made under the influence of abundance. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they formed a trap. The empire became optimized for spending rather than building, for winning the present rather than securing the future. This optimization delivered impressive results early. It also ensured that when conditions changed, adjustment would be painful. The illusion worked because it aligned with human instinct. Immediate success feels more real than distant risk. Visible wealth feels safer than invisible capacity. Spain's leaders were not uniquely flawed. They responded to the incentives before them. But empires are not judged by intentions. They are judged by outcomes. And outcomes are shaped by structure. By the time cracks appeared, the illusion was deeply embedded. Institutions had adapted to abundance. Expectations were fixed. Commitments were locked in. Reversing course would require disruption, sacrifice, and political risk. Those costs felt higher than continuation. And so the empire continued. Confident, impressive, fragile. This was the height of Spain's power and the depth of its vulnerability. The moment when the system looked most successful was the moment when change became least likely. The illusion of strength had done its job. It had convinced an empire that it did not need to change. The cracks did not arrive with noise. They arrived quietly, disguised as inconvenience. Prices and markets edged upward. Wages lagged behind. What once bought abundance now bought less. Silver, once a stabilizing force, began to lose its meaning as more of it flooded circulation. Spain was richer on paper, poorer in reality. Each shipment carried the same weight, but purchased fewer outcomes. This was not a moral failure. It was arithmetic. When money expands faster than production, value thins. The empire felt busier, not stronger. Activity increased. Capacity did not. Inflation moved through daily life before it reached the crown. Food cost more. Supplies strained budgets. Contracts were renegotiated. None of this felt like collapse. It felt manageable. That is how systemic failure often begins. Not with panic, but with normalization. People adjust. States adapt. But adaptation without correction compounds imbalance. As prices rose, the crown needed more silver to achieve the same results. More shipments were required to fund the same army. More borrowing was needed to bridge the same gaps. The system demanded acceleration just to stand still. Debt hardened into structure. What had once been a tool became a condition. Lenders demanded higher returns to compensate for risk. Confidence began to fray at the edges. Defaults occurred, then reoccurred. Each was framed as temporary. Each was justified by expectation of future inflows. But repetition changes perception. When defaults become routine, trust becomes conditional. Credit does not disappear all at once. It tightens. Terms worsen. Leverage shifts. This was the core mechanism of decline. Wealth without productive capacity forces borrowing. Borrowing invites dependence. Dependence weakens sovereignty. Think about that chain. Spain fought wars not only with soldiers, but with credit. Credit allowed speed. It allowed reach. But credit also came with ceilings. Those ceilings were invisible during expansion. They became very real under strain. As obligations grew, flexibility shrank. Money arriving in ports was already promised elsewhere. The crown could not redirect funds without consequences. Every decision was constrained by past commitments. The future had been sold in pieces. When crises emerged, there was little room to maneuver. Liquidity, not territory, became the limiting factor. Power was no longer defined by what the empire controlled, but by what it could pay for on time. Meanwhile, rivals pursued a different path. They invested in shipbuilding, manufacturing, and trade networks. They focused on production rather than extraction. They built systems that generated value continuously. Spain watched this development with concern, but also with confidence in its own model. After all, silver still arrived, but the gap was widening. Production creates resilience. Extraction creates dependence. One adapts under pressure. The other breaks. The empire exported raw wealth and imported finished goods. This imbalance became structural. Domestic industry struggled to compete with cheaper, better produced imports paid for by silver. Investment flowed outward where returns were higher. Skills followed capital. Over time, the internal economic base weakened further. The state's capacity to respond to shocks diminished. Everything depended on continuity. Continuity of mining. Continuity of transport. Continuity of credit markets. When that continuity faltered, even briefly, the effects were immediate. Delayed shipments caused cash shortages. Captured cargo sent shockwaves through finances. Armies went unpaid. Suppliers waited. Confidence dipped. Each disruption exposed how little slack the system contained. There were no deep reserves to draw from. No diversified production to compensate. The empire had optimized for flow, not storage. Rebellions flared in places where payments stopped. Loyalty proved conditional on funding. This was not betrayal. It was economics. Power that relies on payment must keep paying. When money fails, authority follows. Decisions narrowed as options vanished. Leaders faced choices between honoring debts, funding defense, or maintaining internal order. Each choice carried risk. Each revealed the limits of financial leverage. The turning point was not a single defeat or disaster. It was a realization spreading quietly through institutions. The money was no longer enough. The silver could no longer sustain the structure built upon it. This realization arrived unevenly. Some saw it early. Others denied it until the end. But the system had already crossed a threshold. Recovery would now require contraction, reform, and sacrifice. These are politically expensive under any conditions. Under pressure, they become almost impossible. Once faith in the empire's finances cracked, recovery became exponentially harder. Credit relies on belief. When belief weakens, costs rise. Higher interest rates increase burdens. Shorter terms increased risk. The crown found itself borrowing more to achieve less. This is the spiral of financial exhaustion. Not collapse, but attrition. Each year, slightly worse than the last. Each decision made with less room to breathe. The empire attempted adjustments. Taxes rose. Spending was reshuffled. But these measures addressed symptoms, not structure. The underlying imbalance remained. Extraction could not substitute for production. Borrowing could not create capacity. Time, once an ally, became an enemy. The longer reform was delayed, the more painful it became. Institutions adapted to scarcity the way they had adapted to abundance. They improvised. They rationed. They postponed. None of this restored strength. Markets sensed the shift before it became official. Prices reflected risk. Contracts tightened. Confidence moved elsewhere. Financial systems are sensitive to pattern. Once instability appears recurrent, capital seeks safer ground. Spain did not lose money because it lacked silver. It lost money because it lacked trust. Trust that obligations would be met without extraordinary measures. Trust that revenue would cover commitments without perpetual borrowing. Think about the psychological weight of this shift. An empire accustomed to commanding outcomes through spending now found itself constrained by invoices. Power became reactive. Strategy narrowed. The focus shifted from expansion to maintenance, from initiative to defense. This transition is difficult for any state. For one built on momentum, it is destabilizing. Financial collapse does not arrive like invasion. It arrives like fatigue. Systems slow. Responses lag. Errors multiply. The empire continued to function, but at higher cost and lower efficiency. Each year of strain eroded administrative capacity. Talent drained away. Morale dipped. The gap between appearance and reality widened. Externally, Spain still looked formidable. Internally, it struggled to keep pace with its own commitments. This period revealed a critical truth. Wealth is not neutral. It shapes behavior. Spain's early abundance trained institutions to rely on inflows rather than engines. When inflows weakened, those institutions lacked the muscle memory to adapt. Reform requires habits built over time. Spain had built habits of consumption, not construction. Under pressure, those habits failed. The empire's leaders faced a shrinking set of choices. Each carried trade-offs that threatened stability. Cut spending and risk unrest. Raise taxes and risk resistance. Borrow more and deepen dependence. There were no painless options left. This is the moment when decline becomes path-dependent. Past decisions narrow future possibilities. The system's design dictates its response. Financial collapse whispers, then accelerates. It begins as inconvenience. It becomes constraint. It ends as loss of agency. Spain crossed each stage without fully recognizing transition. By the time the shift was undeniable, the tools that might have reversed it were already dulled. This chapter is not about failure of will. It is about failure of structure. Spain's system was built to move money, not to make it. It was designed to spend quickly, not to endure scarcity. When conditions changed, the system revealed its limits. Those limits were not sudden. They were cumulative. The empire did not collapse because it ran out of silver. It collapsed because silver could no longer do the work of strength. The turning point passed quietly. No single announcement marked it. But from this moment forward, the empire would react more than it acted. Its power will be measured increasingly by what it could no longer afford. The engine that once drove expansion now strained to sustain itself. And strain, once persistent, becomes destiny. Spain did not fall in a single dramatic moment. There was no final battle that ended everything. No sudden silence in the halls of power. Instead, the empire faded through paperwork, negotiations, and concessions. Defaults accumulated. Influence narrowed. Control thinned. Palaces still stood. Ceremonies still took place. But something essential was gone. Power drained quietly from the center. Decisions carried less weight. Threats inspired less fear. The empire continued to exist, but it no longer shaped events the way it once had. Trade routes shifted as rivals gained ground. Networks once dominated by Spanish financing and protection found alternatives. Production centers moved elsewhere. Military dominance eroded not because soldiers vanished, but because sustaining them became too costly. The empire's reach shortened year by year. Territories became harder to manage. Allies became more conditional. Loyalty increasingly depended on immediate payment rather than long-term alignment. This was not decay of ambition. It was exhaustion of means. What remained was a state burdened by obligations it could not escape, and structures it could not reform quickly enough. Every attempt at adjustment collided with the legacy of past decisions. Spending cuts risked unrest. Tax increases met resistance. Borrowing deepened dependence. Each option carried consequences that reinforced decline. The empire had become financially rigid in a world that rewarded flexibility. Its institutions were optimized for abundance, not adaptation. The aftermath reshaped Europe's balance of power. Spain's relative decline created space for others to rise. New models of strength emerged. Production, trade, and financial discipline gained prominence over extraction alone. The rules of empire changed. Power increasingly belonged to those who could generate value continuously, not merely capture it intermittently. Spain's experience became a reference point, though not always a lesson learned. This story offers a warning that extends far beyond its time. Wealth is not strength. Money is not power unless it is backed by production, trade control, and adaptability. States that rely on inflows, whether resources, capital, or debt, trade resilience for comfort. Comfort delays reform. Delay increases cost. The pattern repeats across eras, technologies, and systems. The details change. The mechanism remains. Look around the modern world. Think about economies built on borrowing rather than building. Think about confidence rooted in currency rather than capacity. Think about systems that appear strong, because money still flows. Spain's slow collapse shows that decline can happen even while riches still arrive. Especially then, abundance can hide weakness longer than scarcity ever could. The lesson here is not about gold or kings. It is about systems, about incentives, about the difference between money that moves and strength that lasts. When spending replaces strategy and money replaces capacity, collapse becomes a matter of time. It may take decades. It may take generations. But the direction is set long before the fall becomes visible. The Spanish Empire did not run out of silver. It ran out of strength. If the story changed how you see power, history, and economics, subscribe for more deep explorations like this. And if you know someone who thinks wealth alone makes nations strong, share this story with them.